Hello, friends, and welcome. I am standing here in one of the most beautiful places that I have ever been in my life, and we have an opportunity for you to meet a collector who is opening up her home and her little homes for us to explore and learn and enjoy, special for the summer fling. What an opportunity. We're here with Susan Dossiter. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Rachel.
Come on in. Don't you look gorgeous?
Thank you. You do too.
Susan, what is one of the reasons that you wanted to share your collection with everybody at this time, right now?
Well, I've been collecting dolls' houses virtually my whole life, since age 7, and I've never lost my passion for them all these years. And I love sharing with people. I give tours frequently for both children and adults, and to me it's a wonderful opportunity to learn not only about dolls' houses and everything inside of them, but also history. History and dolls' houses for me go hand in hand.
Yes, they are, and I have seen, Susan has been sharing her collection for many years. She is, it's very magnanimous of you to bring us here, and so we are so excited to get in here and see. So this is going to be broken down into 4 different parts, and you have chosen 4 different themes that we're going to learn different things about.
Yes.
So, oh, so exciting. All right, well, I'm going to get behind the camera because we are going to learn about the first house here. And where do we start, Susan?
Well, before we get into the first house, I wanted to give everyone just a very brief history of dolls' houses themselves. So the very first dolls' house known to exist was way back in 1598. And it was built by Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria. We think it might have been built as a gift for his daughter. Now we know the house exists because Duke Albrecht provided a very detailed description of the house and all of its contents. But sadly, that house was destroyed in a fire in 1674. Right around that time, the mid-17th century, was when dolls' houses on a larger scale came into existence. But you have to understand, these were in no way meant for children as toys. Dolls' houses started in the 17th century, mid-17th century, in 2 countries. In Germany, they were meant for teaching tools for older girls, young women about to go into marriage. And many of these fabulous, fabulous dolls' houses can be seen in the Germanische National Museum in Nuremberg. And if you go to visit there, it is phenomenal. These dolls' houses are filled with hundreds and hundreds of objects. And a young girl would have had to have learned how to manage a household and had to learn what all of those objects were for. Because any daughter who was wealthy enough to have a doll's house certainly wouldn't have had much to do with the kitchen and the laundry, etc. up to this point. But she did need to manage the household when she was married. And when you look into these German dolls' houses, I mean, the kitchens are filled with hundreds of implements, all kinds of things used for cooking that we have no idea what they are today. I love to study the way things were before, and I have books on kitchen implements, laundry implements, all kinds of things. When you look into a doll's house that's been properly put together, I like to say it's like a slice of social history. You can see how people cooked their food, how they laundered their clothes, how they bathed, what they wore, how they spent their pastimes, etc. And so these houses were not meant as toys again, but as teaching tools. What goes into a laundry room, what goes into a kitchen, etc. Around the same time, also mid-17th century, in Holland, dolls' houses came to being. But again, they were not meant for children and they were not toys. Holland, at this time, was one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest country in the world, due primarily to the silk and spice trade. And this was a very, very special period in a very special country because this was the first time that middle-class people could aspire to the upper classes. Before that, it was just the landed gentry, nobility, aristocracy, and sort of everybody else, the peasants and the workers. And it wasn't going to change in America or in England, for example, until a good century and a half later, when industry came into being in those countries. But in Holland, due to the silk and spice trade, there were people that acquired great wealth and status. And they like to show off their status. So Holland, different to, say, France, which had great big chateaux in the countryside, or England with its wonderful, huge, stately homes, the main cities that these traders and merchants were working were Amsterdam, Rotterdam on the water. And if you've ever visited there, you see that the houses are very lovely, but they're small row houses or townhouses. And so there wouldn't have been a lot of space in the houses, and miniatures came into fashion. In particular, there were lots of silver miniatures made, and those are actually collectible and findable today. I have lots of Dutch silver miniatures in my collection. But there were also other miniatures being made. The ladies of the household, the wives of these wealthy merchants and traders, would often have a beautiful inlaid, fanciful cabinet, oftentimes right at the entry of their house. And the ladies would enjoy arranging the little miniatures on the shelves. And it was sort of a source of pride for whenever anyone came into the house to show what they had accumulated. And then there were some ladies that liked to have artisans make other types of furniture, all in miniature, and they started arranging them on the shelves in a room setting. Now, gradually these became more and more popular and more like houses, and eventually they even took on architectural details. But these first early cabinet houses were just that, cabinets. And the two of the most famous are in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and they're phenomenal. And there's one that is featured in a relatively recently published historical fiction called The Miniaturist. And they also turned that into a television series. So if you're interested in cabinets and cabinet houses and the history of Holland at that time, that's a wonderful book to read, and a very interesting television series. Although it doesn't really have a lot to do with dolls' houses. It's kind of got a little bit of an evil plot to it.
But it certainly brings it into the conversation. Well, that was fascinating. And you sure know your stuff. That was awesome. So the first house that we're going to look at this is amazing. What kind of house is this?
So the reason I chose this house to start with is this, as you can see, is also a cabinet house. Now this is a cabinet that was literally made into a doll's house. This started as a cabinet and it was made into a dollhouse at a later date. What I love about this house is that it's virtually all original, and when people look at my doll's houses, they always ask, did they come with the things inside? So to find a house in its original condition is very, very rare, a house this early. To find a house with its original contents is almost unheard of, and this is the one and only house in my collection that is that way. So let's take a look inside.
Yes. Let's meander through.
Oh.
Now, how long have you had this house?
I have had this house, gosh, a good, at least 15 years now, I think, or more.
It's obviously one of your very favorites.
You know, people are always asking me what's my favorite house, and it's impossible for me to answer. It's kind of like asking me which is my favorite child.
Yes,
I hope that door
we love
stays
them all.
open. Yes, hopefully it'll stay open. Okay, so do we want something to prop that?
No, that's good. Well, okay, so we're in this, which room do you want to start in?
Always a little speck.
For our home tour. And
Well-
yes, and I know you dusted everything, but sometimes there are little things that show up on camera, but this is the most dusted dollhouse I've ever seen. It looks perfect.
I have to tell you, to clean a dollhouse with its contents is quite the feat. You have to take every little tiny thing out. What I do first is I take a photograph with my iPhone, and then I take everything out. I put the items from each room in a separate shoebox or tray, and I always take a photo. Don't forget that. It makes, even if you think that you know where everything goes, when you go to put it back, it's so much faster and easier if you have a photograph. So I take everything out, and then I thoroughly clean the house with little brushes and little miniature vacuums. And then, if there's any wood, I wipe it down with water mixed with a bit of Murphy oil soap, which is good for the wood. It moisturizes it. And then comes the work of dusting and flicking off dust with tiny brushes and cleaning. And you use Q-tips, toothpicks, you name it, to get into every tiny little creak and crevice. So it is quite the job. And then you have to put it all back. So I said this house was original with its original contents, but there is a caveat. So if you look at this house, anyone who knows anything about history of textiles or decorative arts will say, that doesn't really look like 18th century wallpaper to me. It looks more like Regency wallpaper. And that actually is true. And some of the furniture is 18th century and some of it is Regency. So if you look closely here in the kitchen, you can see that behind the secondary paper, we have the very original paper there. It's sort of gray, painted to simulate stone or brick. If you look close here, you can also see the original salmon-colored paint. Salmon was very, very popular in the 18th century to paint on the inside of cabinets. You'll often see decorative cabinets that are painted salmon-colored on the inside. I don't know why, but it does make a lovely background for items that you're displaying. So this house, this paper here is not considered to be the original. However, when I get a house, a new doll's house, your hope is always that it's 100% original. And that's very rare, as I mentioned. And there's always a decision to be made if it's not 100% original, what to do. So sometimes I get houses that have layer upon layer upon layer of fabric, paint, wallpaper, over and over, glued on top of each other. And you really have to think carefully, do I want to take that off? Now, if it's a good 18th century house, the paints they used in those days were full of horrible things and lots of lead, and they were very strong. And because of that. And so you can often scrape off new paint that's on top of old paint, or wallpaper that's on top of old paint, and come to the original painted finish. But if it's wallpaper on top of wallpaper, as this is, you're really taking a big risk, and you can just ruin it and just destroy the whole thing by taking off the new paper to find the old. I have a house earlier than this, from Holland in fact, circa 1690, and it came with just that, layer upon layer upon layer of paint and wallpaper and fabric, all stuck on top of each other. And I was determined to get down to the original finish. And finally I came up to a layer that was seafoam green, Regency era paper. Well, what they used to make seafoam green color in the Regency era was arsenic. Believe it or not. They used it in food coloring too. And so once I hit that, I was like, no more. I'm not scraping off arsenic and having arsenic dust to breathe in. So I decided to leave that one alone. And it's kind of interesting because you see the history of the house. You see all these layers and different generations over hundreds of years of children that have played with it. So in this case, back to this house, anyone who would rip off this phenomenal Regency era paper would be crazy, and yes, I would never ever have done it. So the original furnishings that came with the house include the two beautiful canopy beds that are also with their original bed coverings. Now it's very, very difficult to find 18th century or even Regency period beds. For whatever reason, they were the first thing to go. They were fragile, they broke, and sometimes even if you find the bed, you'll only have the bed and no fabric on it. Because again, fabrics deteriorate, especially if they were silk. In this case, we have cotton, so that's, I think, why they survived. So all the large pieces of furniture are original. The dressers, the beds. This washstand in the corner is one of the few very early original commercially made pieces by a man named Bub. And he was very special in that he was making in the 17th and early 18th century commercially made furniture. Until then, that nothing was commercially made, and things were just made by hand. The one doll that came with the house was this girl, the cook in the kitchen, and she is definitely Regency period, and she's a Grosvenor doll, which is the type of doll that Queen Victoria played with when she was a princess, when she was a little girl. These dolls, I can talk on and on about them. I just love them. They came completely undressed, and children would dress them with their mother or their governess or by themselves, and they're completely unique. Each one is an individual. Each one is one-off. They're hand-painted, each differently. The clothing is all individual to the doll, and so I think they're just charming.
I have to show the audience this tiny little one right here.
Yeah.
Oh,
which one? This
so,
one?
No, you're
this
tiny,
one?
tiny.
Oh, I've got tinier than that.
You've tinier than that.
Yes, look
we have
down
to see.
here.
Oh my goodness.
So maybe we need something for perspective.
Well, there's my finger, and you guys can see that is the smallest one I have ever seen.
And the fact that she's dressed and she's holding it looks like a little duster or something.
That is absolutely, she is amazing.
I've always loved tiny, tiny things. For some reason, I'm just compelled.
Oh, they're fascinating.
I'm just drawn to them. Yeah.
Everyone is tempted by things in miniature. It's so fascinating. A wonderful way to study.
Now, there's lots of things you can learn about history in this house. As I mentioned, I love the connection to history and learning history through objects. Here we have a little rattle, and it's called the coral and bells rattle. So now, older children would have had these in a large size, or big-sized children, I want to say, would have had this in a large size. Coral was thought to ward away evil and illness, and the bells as well were meant to ward away evil. And so oftentimes you'll see children, adults as well, but children very frequently with coral beads, coral necklaces around their neck. And then there were frequently made rattles with the same materials.
Do you have a favorite room in the house?
Gosh, I always love the kitchen. Kitchens are fun because you can really see, here they're cooking over an open fire. There's an original clockwork mechanism on the above the hearth. I have a much fancier one in another house we're going to see later. And it's just sort of the heart of the house, the hub of the house.
Yeah, there's so much life that happens in the kitchen. It's wonderful. I love this little bonnet. Is that a bonnet that's on the wall?
Yes, it's always fun to, I find decorating the kitchens or furnishing them to be the most fun because I love putting things on the walls. And if you notice, I don't care at all about scale. I intentionally put things in that are completely out of scale. For example, this huge brush, almost as large as this doll, and sometimes things that are too tiny and things that are huge, like this huge spoon. And I do it for a reason. And the reason is that today's miniaturists, contemporary miniaturists that do modern pieces, they work with a scale, typically 1 inch to the foot, sometimes half an inch to the foot. And 1 inch to the foot would mean if an item was 6 inches long, 6 feet long in real life, it would be 6 inches long in miniature. And everything is perfect to scale. I was first inspired to collect dolls and dolls' houses because my mother took me to the Thorne Rooms in Chicago and also to Colleen Moore's Fairy Castle, also in Chicago. And the Thorne Rooms, as well as the Fairy Castle, are done perfectly to scale. And if you buy a book about them, they have beautiful coffee table books about them. You can't tell when you're flipping the pages that it's miniature rooms. They're done so perfectly to scale, they look just like real rooms. But dolls' houses are different, the antique ones, because there was no centralized industry in the 17th century or 18th century. And things were handmade, they were one-offs. Girls played or boys played with whatever they had. And so things were never perfectly to scale. There's a famous doll's house that was owned by Victoria where there's a giant child-sized tea set just sitting right smack in the middle of the floor. And I think it adds so much charm and realism, and then it makes the pieces more toy-like and more primitive. And I just love that. So I intentionally
so much more interesting, I think, too. In this room right here, now this is the living room. There are these fancily dressed. Who are these people that are right here?
Well, this was seemed to be a popular way to dress these little Godner dolls. I have several like this. They're done in sort of a suede and with tiny, tiny beading. I mean, it's incredible when you look at that. The work that went into that is just amazing.
Absolutely.
So it's anyone's guess who they are, and you can, that's the fun of it. You can make up your own story, who's who. When I give tours to children, they're always asking me, who's that, who's that, who's that?
Right.
And I have to come up with stories.
Well, one of the fun things about this, and everyone is dressed different too, so that they can come up with their own little story. Like this one right up here, she could be a queen, going somewhere or something.
Whatever you like, and you can change it. One thing I wanted to point out is that I always have in my doll's houses items that weren't originally intended to be in a doll's house. And I have what I call my sub-collections. So I collect miniature portraits, miniature silver, miniature porcelain, miniature books. And a lot of these pieces weren't intended for doll's houses, but I think they're wonderful in doll's houses. And again, their connection to history. So one example is this, which I don't have hanging, so it's easier to show. So, as I mentioned, I collect miniature portraits and also miniature silhouettes. This is a very special piece. This, on one side, there's a silhouette of an 18th century gentleman, very miniature. This is tiny. And on the other side, you can see that it's a memorial. So you see here a gentleman, presumably the same gentleman, and there's two young girls. And very sadly, there's one large coffin and two very small coffins. And if you take a microscope, or excuse me, a magnifying glass, a microscope would be even better because it's so tiny. But I keep a magnifying glass in this drawer to peek at it. And you can see the names of the that are on the coffins, and you can deduce the story is that the larger coffin is his wife, and the top two are twin babies. And they all died within a few days of each other. So clearly this was an incident of a woman dying in childbirth and babies not surviving, probably very tiny. They didn't have the means that they do today, and the medical capabilities. And this is a piece of history in itself because it tells you how hard it was to give birth so many hundreds of years ago. And the remarkable thing about this is that every single tiny bit of this is done in hair. Every single
look
bit
at that.
of it.
It's hair. I thought it was engraved.
And
that's
even
amazing.
the letters, everything is hair. And if you look closely, you'll see there are different shades. There's a very dark hair, and it's sort of a medium, and then a light. So the three different people. And then here you see three little butterflies. And I have several miniature memorial pieces. And when the butterfly goes, and they have butterflies in them, when the butterfly goes up into the sky, that means that the soul has gone to heaven.
What a sacred little memento. And I'm sure the person that made this is just so happy that it is treasured in your collection. That is just, I love that. And will you just keep it right there on the floor?
I've thought about putting it on the wall, but it's just easier to handle that way.
Yeah.
And this here is another piece that wasn't intended for a doll's house. This is what they call a watch sampler. So similar to all this fanciful, wonderful beadwork and sewing, ladies had a lot of times on their hands, and they did a lot of handiwork and a lot of sewing, as you can see here. Everyone's sewing. And these are typically round because they were made to go inside the case of someone's watch, a watch fob. So this says gratitude on it, and they were often embroidered with little tokens, sayings of love or affection, and initials, things like that. And I framed it. This was originally an antique drapery hook, and this is half of it. I separated it, it came apart very easily, and I used the one half to make the frame. And then the glass is a watch glass. And then I just added a little piece of cardboard. I slipped it in so it's not glued on or anything. You can slip it in and out. And then I added a little wire to hang it.
Well, what a great idea. I'm sure some of our viewers are going to make some too now off of your suggestion. You are so, you're very crafty. This is amazing. It is such a treat to see inside of it and to hear your commentary from everything about the wallpaper to the historical context.
I'll finish with this last thing. This, as you can see, you might wonder what that is. So it is a tiny little cradle made out of half of a pistachio nut.
Oh.
And my daughter made that when she was a little girl. And I used to make things all the time for my doll's houses. And she made this, and I put it in there, and I just love it. I'll never take it out because, first of all, I want to encourage you to like the doll's houses, but secondly, children made all kinds of things for their doll's houses. They dressed their dolls, they made rugs, they made curtains, they made all kinds of things. And so I do too, and here's my daughter is doing it as well.
I love that. I'm sure your daughter has enjoyed this. Susan, what are we going to come up with for part two? What's coming up next in our home tours?
Okay, well, the next house we're going to visit is a very special house indeed. And you'll have to wait till we get there to see it.
Yay! Well, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.